For today's video, we're going to take a closer look at the connection between morality and political beliefs, which is an idea that Jonathan Haidt refers to throughout the article that you all read for today, but I wanted to provide a little bit more hard data demonstrating this connection. I'm also going to be weaving in some sociological concepts that I think provide an even broader perspective on the value and the importance of the 5 moral foundations framework. Okay, so let's revisit this idea of these 5 basic foundations. These 5 basic foundations that are argued to animate most of our moral beliefs. We talked about harm, care, fairness, reciprocity, in-group loyalty, authority, respect, and purity, sanctity. And you'll remember that the harm, care foundation is basically what leads us to disapprove of people who cause pain and suffering, and to approve when people actively alleviate harm or pain. Fairness, reciprocity. This is about our sensitivity to issues of equality and justice and how resources are distributed. And we not only frown upon people who cause injustice, we also frown upon people who break the rules or try to work outside of the system for their own selfish gain. In-group loyalty really has to do with trying to maintain and strengthen our groups. And so this is about celebrating the groups that we're a part of. This is about your sense of duty to your family, your nationality, your school or your sports team, for instance. And we really approve of it when people contribute to the well-being of their groups. We disapprove when people are disloyal or traitors. Authority respect really has to do with the fact that we often have hierarchies of power within our groups, and we expect people to act in ways that are consistent with their position. So leaders should be responsible, and followers should be obedient. And purity and sanctity is connected to our sense of disgust, the possibility for contamination, whether it's physical contamination or more of a spiritual contamination. So now I'm going to start introducing some new concepts. And the place I want to start is this distinction that's been drawn in sociology between something called Geminishaft and Gazelleshaft. And these are the German words, essentially, for community versus society. Now, this is a distinction that was drawn first by Ferdinand Tönnies in 1887. And Tönnies was really motivated by trying to understand the shift that he was observing in his era from life primarily being agrarian, people living in tight-knit peasant communities, towards people moving to bigger industrialized cities during the Industrial Revolution. Now, let's walk through some of the basics of how Tönnies envisions this Geminishaft lifestyle. Geminishaft communities are rooted in personal one-on-one relationships that tend to be pretty stable. So if you're living in a small rural village, if you need help, you're probably going to turn to a neighbor or a cousin rather than a bank, a huge company, or the government, for instance. These interactions between individual people tend to be more governed by traditional rules and understandings. So people might, for instance, follow a code of honor. And the force that binds you to be a good and honorable partner in these interactions might have more to do with your reputation in this network of personal relationships and the expectations that you know other people have of you, right? So you want to be known as a good, honorable, stand-up person. And what this results in is behaviors that tend to prioritize the health of these relationships and the health of the larger group, rather than prioritizing the individual's ability to act autonomously, to express their own personal idiosyncratic desires. Because being too unique and following your own impulses might be disruptive to this delicate network of relationships. And you typically find this lifestyle in communities that are smaller, more tight-knit, more rural, traditional, or agrarian. And you can contrast that with Tönnies' vision of the Gazelleshaft lifestyle. Now, again, this is the translation for society, but you typically think of this as reflecting like a big, bustling, urban, diverse metropolis. And in this kind of community, you are more so engaged in a lot of indirect relationships. Not that you don't have friends or romantic partners or families, but a lot of what you need to get done in a day might be routed through these more indirect means. You might purchase something at a marketplace. You might send an email or fill out a form. You might interact in these more formalized roles like boss and employee or lawyer and client. A lot of your behavior, the things that force you to kind of act nobly, might have more to do with laws and contracts. And that's because once you have this more free-flowing society where there's more diverse types of individuals who are rubbing elbows, once people have more choice and more freedom of movement, you can't rely on people having a shared understanding of how they should act. So instead, you assume that people are acting out of self-interest. And if you want to bind somebody to doing something, you have to do this through something like a contract or a set of laws. And so this system generally prioritizes the rights of the individual. Again, people have a lot more autonomy and a lot more choice. And so if you don't like one relationship, if it's not working for you, you cut that tie and you find another relationship. And of course, you're more likely to find this in communities that are more modern and more industrialized, where there's more options, more free movement, and also less possibility for people to keep close tabs on each other. Okay, so here's why we're talking about this Gazelleshaft versus Geminishaft distinction. It's because this is actually connected pretty intimately to the 5 moral foundations. And the argument here is that in a Gazelleshaft or society lifestyle, you are mainly focused on harm care and fairness reciprocity. Now, why would that be? Well, this is because these are the 2 foundations that do the most to protect individual rights and individual autonomy. If you are trying to act freely, one thing that's important is making sure that other people are not going to be able to harm you. It's also important to make sure that you're not being exploited, right? And so these are sort of non-negotiable moral foundations. Even in a very free-flowing community, we still care about, let's say, somebody not assaulting us physically or somebody not ripping us off in an exchange. But what seems to be more negotiable or more disposable for a Gazelleshaft group is in-group loyalty, authority respect, and purity sanctity. And these are what are called the binding foundations. They tend to be much more heavily prioritized in Geminishaft or community lifestyles. And why is that? Well, we talked about Geminishaft relationships really being based in shared understandings. People in a Geminishaft group are probably keeping closer track of each other, they're monitoring each other's reputations, they have a very clear-cut idea, likely, about what the right way to live is. And that right way to live might include things like, are you worshiping properly? Are you wearing the right clothing? Are you treating your spouse in the correct way and your children in the correct way? Are you showing appropriate respect? And so when people are in each other's business and really expecting that everybody is contributing to group well-being, you're really concerned with whether or not somebody else is showing loyalty. You're going to be very concerned with whether or not they seem to be showing respect for your tight-knit community's very clear-cut norms. And you're also going to consider it somebody else's business whether or not they're acting in a pure and elevated way. Because acting impurely, even if it doesn't cause you personal harm, it might sort of show disrespect for the community. So we see these distinctions between Geminishaft and Gazelleshaft societies in terms of how they prioritize the binding versus individualizing foundations. But this isn't just relevant for understanding our move from an agrarian society to an industrialized society, or for understanding how life might be different if you're living in a tiny town in a rural area versus a big bustling metropolis. This is also relevant to the political distinctions that we see in every single community. And what we find is that conservatives in the US and in other countries tend to prioritize both the binding and individualizing foundations. whereas you see a strong tendency for liberals to specifically prioritize harm care and fairness reciprocity and de-emphasize in-group authority and purity. And let's take a closer look at what this looks like. So there's some data from Jonathan Haidt and Jesse Graham in 2007, and for conservatives, a typical result looks like this. You actually see almost exactly even prioritization of harm, fairness, in-group authority, and purity. They're all important. For liberals, they're putting more emphasis on harm and fairness and substantially less emphasis on the binding foundations, in-group authority, purity. You map them next to each other, and this is what you get. So I actually want you all to pause here and go back to your results from the Moral Foundations questionnaire when you completed it Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. I'm very curious, just for you to personally reflect on whether the results that you saw from the MFQ seem to make sense given your personal political leanings. So, if you identify as more liberal, do you in fact place more of an emphasis on harm and fairness? If you're a little bit more conservative, do you have a pretty even spread across the foundations? And if you're moderate or apolitical or libertarian, are you somewhere in the middle? Okay, so how do we make sense of this? Why do we see these pretty stark differences between liberals and conservatives? Well, I want you to think about some of the stereotypes that we have of these two political groups. So, if you're going to stereotype liberals, you might think of something like this meme series, This is the Future That Liberals Want, which started out with this clip of a person in drag sitting next to a woman in a niqab. When it got on a roll, started to include things like interspecies friendships, apparently a uniquely liberal act, right? But taken all together, the picture you get is of liberals as inviting people to each live their own unique lifestyle. You want to protect the vulnerable, and you hope for an equitable distribution of resources in society. So you still care about people's welfare. But beyond protecting welfare, everything else is sort of fair game. You generally assume personal lifestyle choices are none of your business. And so that kind of rules out placing too much emphasis on things like whether or not another person is acting in a pure way, a respectful way, or a traditional way. And if you want to think about the simplified stereotype of the conservative position, this worldview would argue that there really are certain ways of life that are superior to others, that there are certain tried and true practices and wisdoms that we should follow, and that societal order and kind of consensual understandings about what is right and proper, that these are really important, and that it's sort of dangerous or foolish to throw out traditions and throw out these traditional understandings of order. So while it's not the case that all of liberalism and all of conservatism can be summed up by these differences in the 5 moral foundations, there's definitely a lot going on here. Now, to pivot back to talking about Geminishaft and Gazelleshaft, there's obviously pros and cons to both, which is one of the things that I think is really interesting about both of these frameworks, the Geminishaft-Gazelleshaft distinction and 5 moral foundations. We all have our preferences within these domains. But if you had to choose, are you more attracted to the idea of a tight-knit community where there's a lot of consensus about the right kind of lifestyle to have, but potentially also a lot more community support? So, these strong relationships, people more involved in each other's lives, but maybe also more judgment. Or are you more attracted to the idea of a very free-flowing society where anything goes, people really withhold judgment about each other's lifestyle, but also are maybe a little bit less invested in the day-to-day lives of their neighbors and community members, where there might be less clear guidelines for the right and proper and appropriate way to live or the kind of values you should have? So, I would like you to privately reflect on some of these trade-offs and whether or not you really feel a strong pull towards one or the other, or sort of a blend of both. Okay, so there's one more nuance to the relationship between the 5 moral foundations and politics that I think is really interesting. And that's research showing that you can predict pretty specific granular policy beliefs from the extent to which people endorse each of these 5 moral foundations. And this research, which was conducted by Spasina Koleva and John Haidt and some of their colleagues, was specifically looking at so-called culture war issues, which tend to be these very polarizing political topics that split liberals and conservatives. Things like gay marriage, abortion, pornography, or the death penalty. So when you look at same-sex marriage, you see a really clear pattern. When people people say that purity is a more important aspect of their moral beliefs, this strongly predicts that they are more likely to disapprove of gay marriage. The more that people think that purity is important, the less that they seem comfortable with gay marriage. And you see a really similar pattern for abortion. More beliefs in purity correlates with more disapproval. And same for pornography. And so it really seems like a lot of this left versus right split in comfort with different sorts of sexual issues or in terms of reproductive rights has to do with the moral foundation of purity. Now, when you look at flag burning, it's a really different picture. This has a little bit to do with purity. People who prioritize purity more tend to disapprove more of flag burning, but it also has a fair amount to do with in-group and authority, which makes sense because people who are very against flag burning are probably really invested in protecting the United States as this conceptual entity. When you look at animal testing and the death penalty, it's another pattern entirely. So these 2 policy positions tend to be really strongly predicted by how much people emphasize harm and care. People who have harm and care as a really central part of their moral system are the most likely to be against animal testing and against capital punishment. All right, so that's it for today. Bye, guys.